Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So, over the past few days, the extremist group known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, has launched an enormous assault on several major Iraqi cities, taking complete control of the country's second biggest city, Mosul, and now Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit. The group, which is spread out over northern Syria and Iraq, now controls nearly a third of Iraq and more total territory than the governments of Israel and Lebanon, according to the Long War Journal. Besides Mosul and Tikrit, ISIS now controls the cities of Ramadi and Fallujah, as well as other smaller cities. And the organization has vowed that it will soon be marching toward Baghdad. The occupation of these cities has led to more than 500,000 people to flee Mosul, seeking safer areas of the country. And although Baghdad is currently secure from takeover, violence in the city has largely continued unabated, with more than 60 people killed just this weekend with a new wave of car bombings throughout the capital. These developments have actually led many members of the Republican Party to actually push for airstrikes on Iraq. Because, of course, the people who allowed the current situation to develop as a result of their insanely irresponsible votes for intervention back in 2002 definitely have the authority to dictate current military policy. So while what's happening on the ground is of a catastrophe of epic proportions, the only way it could become worse is if the U.S. decides to get militarily involved in Iraq. Again. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, to put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
The national ethos of America since its inception has been the American dream. In theory, this long-standing ideal means opportunity, success, and the ability to, quote, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and work hard so you can get rich. And after World War II, manufacturing jobs abounded, resulting in an entire industry of blue-collar work that created a thriving middle class. In the 1950s and beyond, the notion of the American dream became typified in an almost cartoonish way. A nuclear family living with 2.5 kids, living in the suburbs with a white picket fence, driving an SUV around the strip mall and encountering only soccer moms. The male, of course, was the sole breadwinner, and the woman belonged in the home, cooking and cleaning. But a couple decades after the mass white flight away from inner cities, this Pleasantville scenario started to fall apart. Women's lib happened, and suddenly housewives started wanting to do more with their lives, other than to exist as merely the partners to their spouse. Fast forward to the Clinton era, where massive deregulation of the financial sector paved the way to an economic collapse on a level not seen since the Great Depression. And after 9/11, domestic spending on social services and the investment of bedrock institutions like education was almost entirely abandoned, replaced with an endless flow of cash to build up the military-industrial complex and embolden the national security state. Millions of Americans were foreclosed upon. College students were plagued with life debt, and the race to the bottom seizures of third world markets continued under neoliberal trade policy, exporting once U.S.-based jobs to places like China and Bangladesh. But look, the notion of the idealized American dream we've all been taught was never meant to be a dream for everyone. In fact, this lifestyle could only be supported at the expense of the have-nots within society. And guess what? People have finally started to wake up to the fact that the American dream is nothing more than an antiquated concept. In fact, according to a CNN Money poll from just this month, a ton of people say the dream is dying. Young adults between 18 and 34 mostly agree that it's simply unattainable, with 63% of individuals saying the dream is downright impossible. This is the same demographic struggling in society right now to find jobs, make ends meet, and somehow pay their bills at a time when income inequality is at a record high. In fact, the level of income inequality measured in each of the U.S.'s 435 congressional districts is so high, America now ranks among the most unequal countries in the world. And among the industrialized world, income inequality is rising faster here than anywhere else. So knowing this, is it any wonder why that same poll found that only 34% of parents believe their children will grow up better off than them? Maybe it's time we start changing the way a dream lifestyle is even perceived. Because as long as we put corporate profits and money first before basic staples like healthcare, education, and housing, the dream remains exactly that, a dream. America is the only industrialized country in the world without a system of universal healthcare, where an uninsured citizen can still go bankrupt just for getting sick. And when it comes to housing, well, there's more than 5 times as many vacant homes in the U.S. than there are homeless people, according to Amnesty International. But instead of focusing on these social ills, our government gives more power and money to corporations who have successfully hijacked our democratic system. Hell, even the most elite academic institutions in the country have recognized that the U.S. embodies an oligarchy rather than a representative democracy. But as long as our leaders double down on the concept of American exceptionalism to advance its agenda on the rest of the world in the name of humanitarianism, we remain blinded to the humanitarian crisis unfolding on our own soil. Because when you're busy preaching about why this country is the most exceptional in the world, it's easy to overlook its downward spiral. So, for anyone still hanging on to that antiquated concept of the American dream, remember the words of the late George Carlin, who said the reason they call it the American dream is because you'd have to be asleep to believe it. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world are descending on Brazil this week for the World Cup, the most anticipated sporting event on the planet. But even before the first game kicked off, clashes between police and protesters on the streets of Sao Paulo signaled a different mood, than in the stadiums. The ongoing protests right now echo demonstrations from last year, where over 1 million people took to the streets all across Brazil, calling out the government's lavish spending in the lead up to the World Cup while avoiding reforms to public services. And although more protests are planned in other Brazilian cities, with the games officially started, the focus is now turning toward football. So to discuss this and the issues behind the sport, I'm joined by Breaking the Set producer Manuel Rapolo. It's been a long time since you've been on,
I know, it's been a while. I got my colors on.
You got your repping.
I picked the right ones today, I think.
You are repping. I want to talk about the protests here, but I wanted to also quote a recent speech that President Dilma Rousseff said. She said, today there's a systematic campaign against the World Cup, or rather it's not against the World Cup, but a systematic campaign against us. I mean, what is she talking about here? What are some of these issues that the demonstrators are calling attention to regarding the government? She's
absolutely right, by the way. And that's kind of hilarious because she's acknowledging that this isn't an anti-World Cup demonstration that's happening every day. And this has been happening since Brazil got their bid for the World Cup. There's protest after protest because not only are they protesting the rampant corruption within the government of Brazil, but they're protesting how much money they've spent on all these lavish expenditures for all these projects all over Brazil. $11 billion they've spent so far just on these programs. There's upwards of 70% of the population see the delay with these projects as being very, very poorly planned by the Brazilian government. They're protesting the lack of health care, lack of education, troubles with transportation. So, I mean, these are problems that you're seeing across Brazil. Just today, there were protests in Sao Paulo. We're seeing some of those images now, I believe. This is the welcome wagon. Like you said, this is the welcome wagon that journalists got, the visitors got, not only protesters in Brazil, and it's happening all across the country.
When you look at photos, it looks like they're at war. Like thousands of just militarized police forces and the tanks and all this stuff. It's crazy. I mean, this year is notably different from years past. I mean, talk about this new movement called the Anti-Cup.
Right. Well, this is actually growing steam on the internet right now. It's called the Anticopa, right? And it's on Facebook. There's a group. It's got well over almost 18,000 likes from what I'm seeing here, and they're posting photos of graffiti that portrays how Brazil may be living and breathing soccer, but you can't eat a soccer ball. The government not addressing the grievances of the protesters, how much money is being spent. There's some tremendous amount of money that's being spent on all these stadiums. A lot of these stadiums that aren't even complete. There's a lot of last-minute construction work going on right now. now that, you know, with 600,000 people flooding Brazil, who knows what if the infrastructure could even hold up.
Yeah, and another thing to take note in is that these are just like one-time usage. I mean, of course, you know, Brazil's a big soccer place, but I mean, it just seems like they build up these giant infrastructures and then they don't really get used, and there's all these one-time jobs and stuff. In fact,
yeah, no, go for it.
Really quickly, in fact, this is really, really crazy. I think people who've been following this story, the evictions of all kind of the poor in Brazil to build this infrastructure. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, there haven't only been evictions in the favelas, these little shanty towns that are near the stadiums, but there was the case of native indigenous Amazonians that were actually evicted from their own land in an area that had this very old Amerindian museum near Rio to make room for area near the stadium. Several dozen of these native groups were evicted, and this is just one example of the type of horrible things that the government is doing just for the sake of this World Cup. A perfect example, I would say, is this stadium in Manaus, which is 3,000 miles away from Rio. You can't even access it by car. It's in the middle of the jungle. It's going to be used for 4 matches. 4 matches. And after that, it's not going to be used again. There's not even a local team that's going to be playing at the stadium again. And this was a $270 million stadium, an eyesore in the middle of the jungle, and who knows who that's displacing.
Right. They're calling them the white elephants, these stadiums here, Manny, for good reason. Talk about the Brazilian government's mantra. Oh, we're creating 700 new jobs, Manny. It's all worth it.
Right. And you keep hearing this with kind of any sporting event. You heard this with the Winter Olympics in Utah. You heard this with the last World Cup. There's all these new jobs that they're creating, and for me, it's almost this regurgitated fact. I don't care if they're predicting 300,000 or 900,000 jobs. We need to be talking about what these jobs are that are being created. Are they temporary jobs or are they permanent jobs? They're definitely not permanent. Most of these jobs, I think the only sector that's actually going to be benefited is transportation, hospitality,
military.
The military, the rise of the militarized police. I think it's completely disingenuous for the government to continue to say that this is creating all these new permanent jobs when at the end of the day, at the end of this month, which is a really great month for unifying the country over football. It's a beautiful thing, but these jobs are not going to be there forever.
Right. Yeah, I love that argument. Oh, it's creating new jobs. It's like, well, you're creating new jobs with anything. You can, the people who were running the death camps, the Holocaust, so they had a job. I mean, that was creating jobs. Is that a reason to have? It's just like this stupid argument. Ironically, all these problems with Brazil seem to pale in comparison to what's coming up in Qatar, Manny. My God, I mean, the slave labor alone is just unbelievable.
Right, so we're looking at a headline right now, and this is what they've admitted to right now. There's all these, according to the labor laws in Qatar, which really mean there's no protections for the workers. There are well over 1,000 migrant workers have already died in Qatar. I mean, this is awful. They're on pace by the time that they actually make it to the World Cup. Around 4,000 is what's expected of migrant workers to have died. And this is just one aspect of it. There's now allegations coming out that Qatar actually bought their bid for 2022. I mean, there are countries calling foul all over the place over this. And in reality, why is Qatar even having the World Cup? They've never qualified for the World Cup. Not to say they don't deserve it for that reason, but it's 120 degrees in the summer.
In that weather?
In Qatar. And
you know what? They could just modify the weather, Manny, just like they did in China. The clouds seeded, it's fine.
It's the same story with anywhere that has these major sporting events. It brings in all this immediate revenue to the economy, but it's nothing lasting. And at the end of the day, hopefully with what's going on in Brazil, we can actually pay attention to these issues and use the World Cup as kind of that, paying attention to the Brazil, let's keep paying attention to these issues.
Yeah, it is really amazing. It brings together the world, it brings together the country, but at the same time, we should be paying attention to all the things kind of behind the scene. Thanks for doing just that, Manny Rapallo. Appreciate you coming back on. Welcome back. Coming up, you guys, I'll talk about some of some of the stories the corporate media won't dare touch. Stay tuned.
I'm the resident, and I'm sick of society sucking. I'm sick of corporations trying to convince us to consume. I'm sick of bankers trying to convince us all that life is all about money. And I'm especially sick of our politicians writing the laws and regulations to protect corporations and bankers while they hang us out to dry. There is just too much crap in today's society. Let's talk about that.
I'm Erin Ade. The financial world moves fast.
What kind of impact do you see these developments having on stocks?
The big banks will only take
There's
on
no
more
demand
risk.
for credit. You're not going to get any economic benefit.
In life, there are booms and there are busts.
Earlier this week, the Brookings Institute released a poll concerning the amount of trust Americans have in their television news sources. Unsurprisingly, Fox News took the top spot, with 25% saying they trusted the station as the most trusted name for their news, as the station is consistently both the most and least trusted news source due to the extreme polarization of the corporate media giant. But far more interesting is that only 5% of respondents said that MSNBC is the most trustworthy news source, a score so low that even The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, a comedy show, is considered more trustworthy. And on top of these pathetically low numbers, all of the corporate media has seen a near unprecedented ratings dip as more and more Americans turn to alternative sources to become informed. So to discuss the reasons why so many people are tuning out the corporate press, as well as the top stories the corporate media is ignoring, I was joined earlier by Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored and a professor at Diablo Valley College. I started by asking Mickey why he included Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning as two of his top censored stories of the past year, considering how everyone knows their names.
Of course, the public by now has long heard of Chelsea Manning, of Edward Snowden. They hear often historical whistleblower names. Daniel Ellsberg, of course, comes to mind. But the way in which these stories have routinely been covered, particularly in the corporate media, is they're covered in terms of personalities. And the corporate media was more interested in the Bradley to Chelsea change. The Snowden narrative has been hero or traitor, or better yet, NBC has certainly led the way to the bottom with not only attacking the journalist Glenn Greenwald, who was breaking the Snowden story, but also attacked Snowden's character insofar as saying that, well, not just is it hero or traitor, but is it traitor or criminal? So that was the frame. You couldn't get better than that. So there's a lot that the corporate media misses on these important whistleblower stories. And it's interesting, too, because you'll see a co-optation by U.S. officials that jump into the mix with their symbiotic relationship with corporate media, which is nothing more than a propagandistic mouthpiece for the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, the White House, and so forth. Kerry, in particular, lauded Ellsberg at one point recently as being an historic whistleblower. But again, these people are ahistoric actors. They don't remember that, over 40 years ago, Ellsberg was demonized. Nixon had people going after his psychiatrist's office to demonize him and go after him. So what we see really is history repeating itself in many ways. In one, I would say one significantly different way, is that the corporate media back in 1971, the New York Times actually was interested in the Pentagon Papers, whereas now, the Mannings, the Snowdens, we hear a lot of criticism from the state and corporate media saying, well, these people should go through proper channels. Well, when they tried to go through proper channels, the corporate media wouldn't report these stories. And that's why we had Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And that's why we've had Glenn Greenwald and formerly The Guardian, now at The Intercept. We have to create new ways in order for these things to come out, like Secure Drop and the Freedom of the Press Foundation and so on, because the corporate media has totally failed on these stories, and they try to distract us with a classic triumvirate of fallacies, and we'll see it writ large all over corporate media. It's the ad hominem, personal attack, shoot the messenger, the red herring, which shifts the topic away from the actual documents, the actual leaks, and so forth, and what they actually say about what our government is doing versus what they claim to be doing. And then third, it's a straw person. They distort an issue, and then they attack the issue that they're distorting as if it is reality.
Mickey, let's talk about the new book soon to be released outlining the top 25 censored stories from the past year, as well as much, much more. In it, there's an entire chapter dedicated to junk food, news, and news abuse. Talk about what you call the corporate media celebrity apology tour.
This last year, one of the biggest problems we saw that corporate media just couldn't turn their eyes away from. In the past, we've done things like grief porn, about how corporate media, they love to look at suffering and celebrity death and obituaries and sort of just go on and on and on about some of these things, the anniversaries of celebrity deaths and so on. In this case, what we see is more like apology porn. one celebrity or public official after another saying something incredibly vile, some bile-spewing filth, epithets, racist, homophobic remarks. And what we see is that the corporate media, they go down to they go to the bottom feeder paparazzi, and they suck up these, these lame tidbits of idiocy, and they project it writ large in the corporate media as if there's nothing better to cover. Right? Like actually issues of real racist institutionalized behavior in the prison systems and so forth. We can go on and on about the stories they could be covering instead. But and there's a long history to this. We have remember Bill Clinton's apology tour, McNamara's apology tour. Lately, though, this year, what we are looking at is we took a look at, say, some of the key cases we saw. John Travolta, right? The John Travolta Oscars mishap, where he mispronounces this woman, Adele Dazeem's name, and then there's a Travolta fire online, and and then there's Justin Bieber apologizing for his yellow Lamborghini joyride and DUI and disrupting the neighbors, and then there's Miley Cyrus apologizing for twerking everywhere and on married men and so forth. And we see Robin Thicke, who was the twerkee at the VMAs, and had to apologize about that for the begathon to get his wife back and so on. It's just on and on and on. It's like this news cycle. Get a dirty element from a celebrity, right? That's the first step. Wash, rinse, spin, recycle, repeat. And, before the last sort of lame PR, hollow apologetic drivel falls from the mouths of these, inane celebrity characters, most recently, Jonah Hill on Jimmy Fallon, and there's actually a whole series of articles that have recently been published about how celebrities can apologize better, right? How Paula did it and turned it into a new lucrative career for her racism. It's just completely ridiculous that this A gets that kind of attention, and B, we pretend as if these are simply one-off mishaps, yet there's a whole train of these things happening, like Alec Baldwin and so on. And then they all come out and say, well, I didn't mean to say that, and I did a great disservice to these communities that I otherwise support. Well, if that's the case, then you wouldn't be doing this anyway. And you certainly wouldn't be giving fodder to the corporate media to go ahead and just keep rehashing this type of nonsense.
And it's also these irrelevant players like Sarah Palin. I mean, why do we even pay attention to this person? It's like, maybe if we stopped paying attention to her, she'd go away, Mickey. And of course, these historical narratives are omitted even when they're not actual celebrities. People are treated like celebrities, like this Bergdahl swap. Of course, the entire historical narrative's omitted. But let's talk about another thing that you've been really vocal about. You've also had a whole chapter in your book coming up about regime change, NATO, U.S., Cuba, Venezuela, Ukraine. I mean, you have a whole chapter coming up about Ukraine. Talk about your media analysis on this entire situation.
It's interesting that the same corporate media that is utterly ahistorical in other narrative stories, they selectively rehash old kinds of frames at their convenience. And in this case, it's in support of U.S. NATO empire or U.S. hegemony, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Syria, whether it's the rekindled Cold War with Putin in Russia. The idea is to demonize these leaders. Now, look, that's not to say that any of the leaders or any of the, say, Gaddafi or Assad or Putin or what have you, don't have their fair share of problems or humanitarian infractions. They all do, like any real world leaders that we could really mention, including in the U.S. But the point is that we pretend like these are caricatures or cartoon characters, and the corporate media work to demonize these people so that we can then sort of justify what we have going on. Meanwhile, there's very little coverage done on the makings of these regime changes in Libya, in Syria.
Of course, we see Joe Biden's son just getting right in there, totally unabashed. It's just so overt, the corruption. Blatant.
How can you even be I mean, I don't even know how you could ignore some that
well,
kind
they don't even care. I mean, they don't even care. We have only 2 minutes left, so I wanted to quickly move on to this. It's just hilarious because I was thrown in the crosshairs of the saga a couple months ago. You've written about it in the new book as well. I wanted to read you a quote from a blog by a Time magazine editor, former Time magazine editor, posted at the State Department about RT's reporting. He says these are not facts, they're not opinions, they're false claims, and when propaganda poses as news, it creates real dangers and gives a green light to violence. Inflammatory as hell here, Mickey. What's your assessment?
Well, it's not only inflammatory, but you'll see it's a steady pattern. Newsweek recently had a piece on their cover that was about conspiracy theories, how they're dangerous. Of course, people love to trot out the conspiracy theory label to discredit people. It's, again, part of the ad hominem process, attacking, shooting the messenger, changing the subject to the person. It goes back to Hofstadter, the paranoid style in American politics. So there are real conspiracies. There are ways to responsibly study them. Peter Dale Scott, deep state, deep politics, deep events, state crimes against democracy. I could run down a laundry list of people that do this kind of scholarship. You know, Mark Crispin Miller, Aaron Good. We do it at Project Censored. You know, there's a number of great independent reporters that do serious work, but they are, again, attacked if they sort of go to the sacred cows. If they go and they really try to analyze, you know, things that are happening. And this, you were thrown into the mix here because of RT was called into question as being a propagandistic arm of the Russian state. And while we could say any media outlet is a form of propaganda, and we should look at their funders and look at their backers, whether it's Omidar, whether it's public television, and so on, and those are real issues. But what we should also do is remember to the importance of critical thinking and media literacy. We should listen to the arguments. We should look at transparently sourced facts, and we should think independently for ourselves and not come to ideologically driven conclusions, but rational conclusions, again, based on evidence. And what happened in your case, for example, was a classic example of how when you suited the purposes of the corporate media and the state, you were lauded for criticizing Putin on RT. But then when you had a chance to go on CNN and stick it to Piers Morgan, you didn't even seem to get it that you were critiquing him. I mean, and again, I mean, you know, Christina Borgeson has written books about this stuff. You know, there have been books and documentaries done about censorship in the U.S., reporters being fired in the U.S., and so on. I mean, so the hypocrisy is, again, very, very striking. But I'm afraid that the corporate media don't really want to recognize these kind of facts. They want to attack others. And look, if attacking and framing doesn't work, and slighting of content, false equivalency, false balancing doesn't work, then they're going to go back and rely on the junk food news problem. So all we can hope for, I guess, in America is that, you know, if only John Travolta would mangle the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad's name while Miley Cyrus twerks on him in the driver's seat of a yellow Lamborghini with, you know, Justin Bieber, you know, maybe then people would pay attention to what's going on in global affairs. We really don't know. At Project Censored, we hope that people will simply think independently and critically on their own, turn off corporate media, which more and more Americans are doing every year, and really start tuning into independent media and really start doing independent critical thinking. And your viewers can learn more at projectcensored.org.
Amazing. Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored. Incredible to have you on, man. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.
That's our show, you guys. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again. Smaller cities, and the organization has vowed that it will soon be marching toward Baghdad. The occupation of these cities has led to more than 500,000 people to flee Mosul, seeking safer areas of the country. And although Baghdad is currently secure from takeover, violence in the city has largely continued unabated, with more than 60 people killed just this weekend with a new wave of car bombings throughout the capital. These developments have actually led many members of the Republican Party to actually push for airstrikes on Iraq. Because, of course, the people who allowed the current situation to develop as a result of their insanely irresponsible votes for intervention back in 2002 definitely have the authority to dictate current military policy. So while what's happening on the class in the 1950s and beyond, the notion of the American dream became typified in an almost cartoonish way. A nuclear family living with 2.5 kids, living in the suburbs with a white picket fence, driving an SUV around the strip mall and encountering only soccer moms. The male, of course, was the sole breadwinner, and the woman belonged in the home, cooking and cleaning. But a couple decades after the mass white flight away from inner cities, this Pleasantville scenario started to fall apart. Women's lib happened, and suddenly housewives started wanting to do more with their lives other than to exist as merely the partners to their spouse. Fast forward to the Clinton era, where massive deregulation of the financial sector paved the way to an economic collapse on a level not seen since round is of a catastrophe of epic proportions. The only way it could become worse is if the U.S. decides to get militarily involved in Iraq. Again. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, to put something on the air, it's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So, for the past few days, the extremist group known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, has launched an enormous assault on several major Iraqi cities, taking complete control of the country's second biggest city, Mosul, and now Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit. The group, which is spread out over northern Syria and Iraq, now controls nearly a third of Iraq and more total territory than the governments of Israel and Lebanon, according to the Long War Journal. Besides Mosul and Tikrit, ISIS now controls the cities of Ramadi and Fallujah, as well as others. The national ethos of America since its inception has been the American dream. In theory, this long-standing ideal means opportunity, success, and the ability to, quote, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and work hard so you can get rich. And after World War II, manufacturing jobs abounded, resulting in an entire industry of blue-collar work that created a thriving middle